Hey, this is Nick with the Biblical Languages Podcast. We're hosting a linguist lab on lexical semantics on Thursday, October 28th at 3 p.m. Eastern. The purpose of the linguist lab is to take the concepts we've discussed in this podcast series and apply them to real Greek and Hebrew examples. This is a live event, so you'll be able to engage and ask questions. You can register using the link in the description of this podcast episode. Now let's dive into the episode.
Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. I am Kevin Grasso, your host for this episode, and I'm excited to talk with Keren Dubnov today about the locative alternation in Biblical Hebrew. Welcome to the show, Keren.
Hello.
So just a little bit about Keren. Keren is a teacher in Hebrew linguistics at the David Yellin Academic College of Education in Jerusalem. She worked as a scientific secretary at the Academy of the Hebrew Language for many years. Her main specialty is pre-modern and modern Hebrew grammar, including its biblical sources. So today we're going to talk about what's called the locative alternation in biblical Hebrew. And she and Edith Doron wrote an article called The Locative Alternation in Biblical and Modern Hebrew. So that's going to be our topic for today. And Keren is going to walk us through some of the arguments and insights in this paper. So let's begin with the very basic question: what is the locative alternation and what are locative verbs?
First of all, Kevin, thank you for inviting me. This article is primarily edits. I'm the second author. Locative verbs. Locative verbs have two arguments besides the agent. Locatum, which is some kind of entity placed somewhere, and location, or simply a place where the entity is located.
Great. So the idea is that things are in space. They have a location, right? And the thing itself is the locatum, right?
Yes, we used to say locatum in Latin,
right?
Because it's a Latin word, but it also can be pronounced as locatum.
Right. So then, what are the two classes of locative verbs, and how are they distinguished?
Well, any locative action may be produced in both directions. One is placing the entity in or on the location, or the other is taking it out of the location. Respectively, locative verbs are divided into two groups: verbs of putting and verbs of removal. Now, the locative alternation originates in a possibility to lexicalize the two complementary arguments of locative verbs in many languages in two different ways. We may express the locatum as a direct object and the location as a prepositional phrase, or vice versa. For example, in English, in case of putting, one can load hay onto a truck or load the truck with hay. In case of removal, one can clear the dishes from the table or clear the table off the dishes. In each pair, both sentences express exactly the same action, but the structure of each sentence is different. It is a kind of a mirror image of the other one. For the structure with locatum as direct object, we used the short name frame A. And for the structure with location as a direct object, Edith and I used frame B.
Great. So just to define these again, right? The frame A, the locatum, is the direct object. So load hay onto a truck, right? Hay is the thing that is moving, right? Or load the truck with hay. It's frame B, where the truck is the location where the hay is, right? and load the truck there is the direct object. So the difference between frame A and frame B are what is the direct object, whether it's the thing that's being moved or the location where it's moved to. So great. So that brings us to locative verbs in Biblical Hebrew. So what makes the locative alternation of verbs of putting and removal interesting in Biblical Hebrew?
Well, the locative alternation is not a rare thing. It takes place in many languages. But usually the prepositions in the two syntactic structures are different, just as we can see in the English examples I gave. Load hay onto a truck, but load the truck with hay. And in removal, clear the dishes from the table, but clear the table of the dishes. The preposition is different, and so it is in most languages. In some languages, the preposition is the same only in verbs of removal. This is the situation in Spanish with the preposition de, and in Arabic with min, which is like in Hebrew. But in verbs of putting, the preposition is different in these languages also. An interesting feature of Biblical Hebrew, actually Hebrew in general, that the typical preposition is the same in both frames, both in verbs of putting and in verbs of removal. It is be for putting and min for removal.
Great. So that's really helpful. So now at this point, let's look at some examples. So what are some examples of locative verbs in Biblical Hebrew?
Okay, let us start with removal. I would start with the verb parak, which has a very wide definition of removal, like to take off. For example, in Genesis 27:40, in Jacob's blessing to Esau, Vehaya ka'asher tarid ufarakta olo me'al tzavarecha. I will give here the English translation from the New King James Version. And it shall come to pass when you become restless that you shall break this yoke from your neck. Here, the direct object is exactly the entity to remove the yoke, while the location, which is here the neck of Esau, is lexicalized in a prepositional phrase, me'al tzavarecha, literally from over your neck. This is how frame A works. Now, let us see an example with the same verb in the other structure in Psalms 136, 24. Vayifrekenu mitzarenu ki le'olam hasdo. He rid us of our enemies, for his mercy endures forever. Here we see the same verb, parak, with a pronominal direct object in the affix, but it doesn't encode the thing that should be removed. The enemies are required to get out of us, and they are encoded in the indirect object, in a prepositional phrase with the preposition mi, which is eclectic of min. This is how frame B works.
Great. So here we have one verb, right? Parak, which you've said has a pretty broad range of meaning, and we see that it can be used in both frame A and frame B, which means that the object it takes can be either the locatum, the thing that moves, or the location, the place where the thing is, right? So then we have that. So we have that as an example of verbs of removal. So now, what are some examples of verbs of putting?
Let us see two examples with the verb of putting, with the verb mille, to fill, which also can appear in both frames. We start again with frame A. In Exodus 27:17, where God explains to Moses how Aaron's breastplate of judgment should look like. ומילתה בו מילואת אבן, 4 טורים אבן. And thou shalt set a fill in settings of stone. We can see the indirect object bo immediately after the verb umileta. It indicates the location, the breastplate of Aaron in this case. And then comes the direct object, miluat even, settings of stone. What should be put in it. Another example, in this case from a late biblical Hebrew, but it is not really important, can be found in Ezra 9:10. הארץ אשר אתם באים לרשתה, ארץ נידה היא, בנידת עמי הארצות, בתועבותיהם אשר מילוה, מפה עד פה בתומתם. In English, the land which you are entering to possess is an unclean land, with the uncleanness of the peoples of the lands, with their abominations, which have filled it from one end to another with their impurity. In this example, the direct object is the location, the place that is filled with the entity, with the impureness, which is encoded in the indirect object. You can notice that unlike in English, a biblical Hebrew uses the same preposition be for the indirect object in both frames. ומילתה בו מילואת אבן and מילאוה בטומאתם with their impurity.
Great. So here we have an example, just like parak, right? We have mile, which is an example of a verb that is used in both frames, frame A and frame B. So milua is where you have filling, and the direct object is the land, right? Which is the location. And
yes, this is frame B.
Right. That's frame B. And then umileta vo, right? In that case, vo is referring to the breastplate, right? And that's the location. And then there you have it with the preposition, which is frame A. So the point of this, right, is we have, and again, what's surprising about biblical Hebrew is that in both verbs of removal and in verbs of putting, we have this alternation with the same preposition, right? So then what is the syntactic frame most common with these classes of verbs?
Actually, the alternating one. Edith and I were actually surprised to find out how many of the locative verbs in biblical Hebrew do alternate, even more than in modern Hebrew. Dozens of verbs appear in the Bible in both frames. Zara, for example, to sow, mashach, to anoint, amas, to load, and in case of removal, pinna, to clear, and even hesir, to remove, which is completely impossible in modern Hebrew, and many, many others. Moreover, the biblical corpus is certainly limited, and if a typical locative verb is present only in one frame, we should not assume that it never appeared in biblical Hebrew in the other one. I will give an example. The verb sachat with sin, to squeeze, appears in the Bible only in frame B, namely in Genesis 40:11, ואקח את הענבים ואסחט אותם אל כוס פרעה. And I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup. But we can easily imagine that biblical Hebrew speakers could also say sahat mitz, to squeeze juice, not just the fruit, exactly like post-biblical Hebrew speakers did. So we can say, you can imagine, maybe guess, both frames, although we have only one of them in the Bible.
Right. And that's the important point about biblical Hebrew in general, right? That our corpus is very limited. So we can't assume anything when we don't find something. But what's interesting about, your work with Edith in this regard is how many verbs you did find, even though there is a limited corpus, right, that have this same alternation. So now the question is, right, do all verbs show this same kind of alternation?
No, not all of them, but the majority of them do.
So then what types of verbs have only one frame? So what would we find that, might only be in frame A or only be in frame B?
Actually, frame B. There are several verbs, actually few, much less than alternating verbs, that have only one frame. They have frame B, with the location as a direct object. By the way, in this situation, both in biblical and in post-biblical Hebrew, we have only frame B. So it's kind of another class of verbs, and they seem to have a rather different semantics. Edith actually proposed that they are not real verbs of motion. They are rather something else. They are verbs of deprivation, as Beth Levin and Malka Rappaport Chovav called them in one of their papers. For example, the verb gamal, to win from a breast, is one of the clear examples, as in the first book of Samuel 1:24. Vata'aleho ima ka'asher gemalatu. When she had weaned him, Hannah weaned Samuel, she took him up with her. This verb, gamal, cannot be used without, with a noun meaning milk or breast as a direct object, but only baby as a direct object. I mean, we cannot use this verb in frame A.
Right, exactly. So that's really interesting. So at this point, the question, another question that comes from this is why can the same preposition be used for both the location and the locatum, right? We saw that this is, happens in some other languages, right? But biblical Hebrew in particular seems to be special in this regard. It can be used for both verbs of removal and in verbs of putting, and it's very widespread. So why do we have the same preposition for both arguments in this case?
Yes, biblical Hebrew is particularly symmetric in this point. How can we explain this? We can explain this by viewing the general semantics of a locative event. Placing an object in a location actually denotes the idea of bringing both of them to a close connection with each other. The preposition be expresses this connection independently of the complement alignment on the frame, A or B. Similarly, removal indicates separation between two objects, the locatum and the location. And the preposition min expresses this meaning of separation in a very general, completely symmetric way.
Yeah, so we can think of it then like, when I say something like the ball is close to the cup, we also understand that to mean that the cup is close to the ball, right? In logically, we have this sort of identity between, if two objects are a certain distance away from each other, object A is so far from object B. Object B must also be identically, distant from object A. So the why is this symmetric situation possible in biblical Hebrew, and how does this relate to what's called verb framing, right? In Leonard Talmy's typology, and this is something that you guys discuss, right? You have verb frame versus satellite framed languages. So how does this situation relate to Talmy's typology?
Yes, you are right. Talmy's typology is actually a very deep topic, and here we mention it very briefly. But there is a clear connection between the symmetric situation in biblical Hebrew and being a biblical Hebrew a verb-framed language. Classical Semitic languages are all considered to be verb-framed, and so is biblical Hebrew, of course. In such languages as Leonard Talmy had proposed, the path of a movement is mainly encoded not in the preposition, but in the verb itself, in its root. In the Bible, there are many verbs that mean not only moving in and out, up and down, like in other verb frame languages as Romance languages, but actually more than that, also moving right and left, to the north, to the south, and so on and so forth. That means that biblical Hebrew is extremely verb framed, very clearly verb framed. And in this case, the locative semantics of the preposition must not be very specific. It can be very general. It can make do with a very general meaning. On the other hand, in a satellite language like English, this could not work at all, because the main information about the direction of a movement, about its path, is lexicalized in a preposition.
Right. And so at this point, maybe I can explain a little bit about English, right, and how it might be different, because most people probably haven't heard of this distinction between satellite and verb-framed languages. So in English, I can say something like, I strolled to the park, right? Where to the park is giving me the direction, right? And it's also telling me that I actually went on a certain path, and that path was ends at the park, and it starts where I am. Whereas in biblical Hebrew, you couldn't just say I strolled to the park, right? Because the preposition itself doesn't give you the path, and the verb stroll in English and the equivalent in biblical Hebrew, which they don't really have one that I know of, wouldn't mean direction, right? It would just mean something like how I moved, and not where I went. So the point is that English as a satellite framed language parses out these kinds of verbs differently with their prepositions than biblical Hebrew as a verb frame language. So that being said, right? I will discuss more of that and how all that fits in, to what we're talking about later. But going back to verbs of putting and removal, are verbs of putting and removal mutually exclusive? What is the relationship between these two?
Well, they are not necessarily exclusive. Some verbs may denote the path itself, but both in terms of the goal and in terms of the source. And in this case, the same verb functions sometimes as a verb of putting and sometimes as a verb of removal. A good example can be the verb shilah, to send. For example, in Deuteronomy 32:24, Veshen behemot eshalach bam. I will send a teeth of beasts against them, or literally in them. Here, shilach is a verb of putting. On the other hand, in Exodus 12:33, it is a verb of removal, certainly with a different preposition. ותחזק מצרים על העם למהר לשלחם מן הארץ, which means they might send them away from the land.
Great. So then what are the necessary conditions for a verb to alternate? We've said that many verbs do, but some don't. So what conditions have to be met in order for a verb to be found in both frames?
Well, here is the conclusion. The alternation needs two necessary conditions. Number one, the verb denotes action by an agent towards a result state. Both locatum and location are arguments of a preposition denoting the result state. Number two, the preposition denotes a symmetric result state which can be equally predicated of the locatum or the location.
So this number two is what we talked about earlier, right? Where when we can think of how locatums are related to locations, they are symmetrical, right? Because like we said, a ball is the same distance from a cup as the cup is from the ball, right? And so if we say one is the location and one is the locatum, either way, it's going to be symmetrical. So
something special for Hebrew.
Right. And so what's surprising about that in Hebrew is, as we said, we can use the same preposition. So you have an example on this with some. So can you explain this one to us?
Some is to put. It's the most basic verb of putting. And here is a great surprise. If we understood correctly the example, it is probably present in the Bible, at least in one case, in frame B. One could naturally expect it in frame A only. Can we imagine putting a location in an object? It sounds quite weird indeed. Nevertheless, in the second book of Kings 9:30, we can read about Jezebel, Vatasem bapuch eineha, which literally means she put her eyes in paint before her haters arrived to kill her. It is clear that the paint and not the eyes is moving. But as we saw, that the verb and the preposition bear lexicalize, just bringing the two objects together. It looks now much more logical and not so much surprising.
Yeah, and it's not surprising from a sort of logical standpoint. Like, we can understand the logic, but this is something when you read it, I mean, and you as a modern Hebrew speaker would probably agree that you wouldn't normally say this in modern Hebrew, right? And you certainly wouldn't.
Never.
Right. You certainly wouldn't say it in English. She put her eyes in paint.
It is as strange in modern Hebrew as in English.
Right. Yeah. So that's what's really fascinating about this study is that we have certain expectations about how the locative alternation should look like from our own language, and when we come to the biblical text, what you guys point out and what's really helpful is that those expectations aren't really met, right? When we look at it through English eyes, right, or even modern Hebrew eyes, we find ourselves surprised at some of the examples. Great. So that concludes our deep dive into the locative alternation in biblical Hebrew. Thank you, Keren, for joining us.
Thank you, Kevin. It was my pleasure to be your guest here.
Okay, as the second part to my interview with Keren Dubnov, I wanted to talk a little bit about the co-author of the paper that we discussed, and that is Idit Doron. So Idit actually passed away a couple of years ago. She was a professor at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where I studied, and I actually took a semantics class with her and just learned a lot from her. And she was just a really good scholar, just well respected in the field, both in semantics and syntax, and just loved by a lot of people. So I wanted to do this section kind of as a tribute to her. She was actually on my thesis committee for a little bit, and she was just a really a very generous scholar, and was someone that, just looking back, I remember her sort of taking me under her wing in some ways, and kind of fueling in me this passion for more linguistics, for formal semantics, for syntax, and specifically applying it to Biblical Hebrew. And she was really a pioneer in this field. She won the Israel Prize in 2016, which is the most prestigious award for scholarship in Israel. And I think she's the only linguist to ever do that. I know she was the first. And it was for her work on Biblical Hebrew, and specifically its relation to modern Hebrew. And it's interesting because, in Israel, she was known for this, especially at the end of her life. She began to work on Biblical Hebrew more and more. But this is, in other circles, especially in the West, like a lot of people have never heard of her. Part of it, I think, is because her framework, right, is more generative syntax and formal semantics, and that's harder to break into for people. But she really did groundbreaking work on Biblical Hebrew from a linguistics perspective. And so her background, she did her PhD in linguistics at, I believe, the University of Texas in Austin. And she was just, she was just a linguist, right? But obviously she was Israeli. And so she came at Biblical Hebrew from, a linguistics background, and no presuppositions about, what the grammar might tell her. And that sort of fresh perspective is I think very, very needed in the field of grammatical studies in Biblical Hebrew. So I wanted to, if I, could, I would have done this interview with her. And because she really was the one who pioneered this idea that Biblical Hebrew is what's called a verb-framed language. And this is something that's very important, actually, for how we understand lexical semantics in Biblical Hebrew. There are many kind of things that fall out from this classification. So I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about what this actually means to be a verb-framed language, and what are its implications, and what are the arguments that she gives for why this matters, specifically for, in the context of the paper with Keren, verbs of pudding, right? Why does this matter for those kinds of verbs? So the idea of verb frame languages versus the counterpart is satellite frame languages comes from a cognitive linguist named Leonard Talmy. So this idea was taken by generative linguists and put into a syntactic framework. And cognitive linguists also use the same idea, but there was something about, or there is something about this idea that fits very well actually with a generative syntactic framework, which Idit held to. So the basic idea is that there are two basic components of meaning in motion verbs. There's a path and a manner. And it doesn't mean that both of these always have to be present, but we can conceive of this, right? For Leonard Talmy, it's like cognitively, we can say, okay, when something moves in a certain way, right? And it goes a certain direction. So the idea is that we have this path, right? Let's say from point A to point B. And the question is that meaning contributed by the verb or by some satellite, right? And by satellite, we just mean something like a prepositional phrase or a particle or something else, okay? So this is best illustrated with an example, and this gets, very abstract very quickly. So I think it's good to just look at the data. So English is a satellite frame language, okay? And what that means is that the path can be encoded in a satellite, right? Let's say a prepositional phrase, okay? So for example, we can say Harry waltzed to the market or Sally strolled to the corner, right? And in these examples, waltz doesn't give you a path, okay? You can waltz anywhere. You can waltz in place. You don't need to, be going anywhere actually to waltz, right? You can stay in the same location. And then to the market actually gives you the path, right? So there is this, so the waltz part is manner, and the prepositional phrase, which is, what Leonard Talmy called a satellite, is actually giving you the path. The same thing with Sally strolled to the corner, right? And we can do this with all kinds of, we have a ton of verbs in English that can give the manner of motion. So one would think, as an English speaker, that every language can do this, but it turns out that some languages just don't allow this type of construction. So probably the most studied alternative to this, right, is Romance languages. So you have a language like Spanish, right? And Spanish is a verb frame language. So what a verb frame language means is that only the verb can encode the path, right? So just to point out, in English, English being a satellite frame language does not mean that the path must be encoded in the satellite, right? It can be encoded in the verb as well. If you said Harry entered the room, right? Enter encodes the path, and that's fine, right? But in languages like the Romance languages, like Spanish, you actually cannot put the path in a satellite. So in order to say the equivalent of Harry waltzed to the market, you have to say Harry went to the market waltzing. Okay? So in that case, the went is giving you the path, and waltzing is giving you the manner. But you need, in Spanish, in order to, describe that event in the same way, you actually have to have two verbs. You have to have went and waltzing. Whereas in English, we can just say waltzed to the market, right? And so there's a lot of interesting things about this. There's a lot of different syntactic properties that co-occur with whether a language is satellite framed or verb framed, which we're not really going to get into right now. We'll post a link to some articles on the blog. But what's interesting is that modern Hebrew is a satellite frame language, or it's at least becoming a satellite frame language. There are a lot of satellite framed language type of constructions, whereas biblical Hebrew, unlike modern Hebrew, is a verb frame language. So there are some constructions, if you were to translate them into modern Hebrew from biblical Hebrew, and this has actually been done and shown to be the case, they would look different because of this difference in how the languages structure these kinds of motion events. So an example of this is something like Genesis 37:28. So the text reads as follows. It says, so this is Joseph, right? He's in the pit, and his brothers are bringing them up. And it says, Vayimshechu vaya'alu et Yosef min habor. So the idea is that you have two verbs here. Vayimshechu is they drew or pulled, right? And so this gives you the how, the manner of Joseph, right, moving somewhere. Vaya'alu, right, is is they lifted him, right? Or, or they made him ascend, right? From the pit, okay? Or the cistern. So the idea here is that you have two verbs. One of them is giving you the path, and that is vaya'alu. And one of them is giving you the manner, and that is vayimshechu. And so, whereas in English, we might just say they pulled him out of the pit, right? In Hebrew, you can't do that. You have to have that other verb there, vaya'alu, to show the direction or the path on where Joseph goes. Okay? So keep in mind, even in English, right? It's not very natural to say, and they pulled Joseph and lift him out of the pit. But that's because, right, in a very literal translation, we translate it that way because in Hebrew the equivalent construction in English is actually impossible. So there are other examples, that are more difficult. Another example that is often brought up in the literature, and in the literature is mostly Idit and Malka's work, is 2 Kings 9:16, and I think this is a good example on just some of the difficulties that are involved with doing this kind of work. It says, "Vayirkav Yehu vayelech Yisraela." So here we have Vayirkav and then Vayelech. So in the ESV, for example, it says, "Then Jehu mounted his chariot and went to Jezreel." Right? So this is actually a bit of an ambiguous construction. It could be that, what the ESV says, right? Jehu mounted and then went, right? Or it could be this same sort of construction that we've been discussing, where Vayirkav could give the manner and Vayelech could give the direction. So we know he's going to Jezreel, right? And he went there riding, right? So the best way to say that in English would be Jehu rode to Jezreel. In Hebrew, you can't say that. So you would have to say Vayirkav Yehu Vayelech, right? He rode and he went to Jezreel. So this is an example where it's actually very difficult to tell based on the meaning of rachav, right? What exactly does that verb mean? Does it mean to mount on something, or does it mean to ride something? And really, it can mean either, right? But in this case, it's ambiguous on what Vayirkav is actually doing. So those are just a couple of examples of the verb framed nature of biblical Hebrew. You can look at other examples from their papers. But so what is the significance of this for biblical Hebrew? So one of the significant points is that the meaning of the prepositions in biblical Hebrew are actually locative or stative and not directional. And this is different than English, right? So this has been discussed, right, in the literature on this phenomenon. What exactly does this tell us about the language, right? Does this tell us that all of these verbs have a different meaning than they do in English? A hypothesis might be that waltz means something different in English than the closest equivalent to waltz in Spanish. Waltz encodes both a manner and a path, and Spanish encodes just a manner, for example. But this is probably not the case, right? Because you see this across the lexicon, right? I mean, for whatever reason, Spanish doesn't have any manner of motion verbs that combine, or a very, very select few that combine with, these satellites that encode the direction. And so the idea is that some people have said, well, maybe this is not about the verbs. It's actually about the prepositions, right? So in a satellite framed language, like in English, right, where you can say Sally strolled to the corner, the idea is that the preposition to is actually giving you the direction. And so stroll doesn't need to give you the direction, and they combine and it's fine, right? So here we have stroll giving you the manner, and to the corner giving you where you're actually going. But if you have a language where this construction is not allowed, then it might be the case that the reason is that the equivalent of to the corner in that language actually doesn't give you the direction, right? And this is what has been proposed. Just that the prepositions in that language are locative or stative and not directional. And this is exactly what Edith says in their paper. So you have many examples of this in Biblical Hebrew as well, where you have a preposition like el, which is normally translated as to, or le, often translated as to, or even the so-called directional he, also often translated as to, so you have examples where all of these can mean that something is just in a state, right? And there's no movement involved at all. So an example, I won't read these, but of el is Deuteronomy 33:28. The directional he, which is really like a locative he, is Genesis 28:12. And in these examples, there's no movement involved. It just shows that the whatever goes with el is just happens to be in a certain location. And so when you have phrases like vayipol arza, right? You have he fell to the ground, right? Is how you would translate it into English, which is a good translation, right? The verb is actually giving you the path, and the he at the end of eretz, right? Arza, is giving you the location of where the person fell. Since the locative he is only interpreted as directional in the context of verbs that specify a direction, right? So the locative he is not actually giving you the direction itself, because the only time we get that interpretation is when we know that the verb is giving you a direction. So why does this matter for verbs of putting? So in their paper, they say that Hebrew prepositions do not encode a direction, but only a location or a state. And so this makes them more amenable to a symmetric interpretation. So a symmetric interpretation with a preposition, for example, is like next to, right? So if I said, the computer is next to the phone, I can also say the phone is next to the computer, right? And so when you have this sort of symmetric interpretation, you can switch the arguments in a construction, right? And that's exactly what they show, that with verbs of putting or with verbs of removal, you can switch the locatum or the location arguments. And the reason for this actually is that prepositions in Biblical Hebrew mean something different than, just across the board, than their closest equivalents in something like English, right? Whereas in English, as a satellite frame language, we have prepositions that specify a direction. Biblical Hebrew does not have that. Modern Hebrew does have that, actually. Biblical Hebrew does not. And so that allows for these kinds of constructions and these kinds of symmetric relationships and really all kinds of different argument realization patterns that are just different than some of the other languages that Biblical Hebrew is translated into, for example. So I say all of this, one, to just explain Keren and Edith's paper in more depth and to show how it's relevant, but two, also to encourage our listeners to get into Edith's work. She's got all of her work is posted online, and we'll post a link to that in the show notes, along with a more detailed description of what I discussed here. But Edith has really made a huge impact on our understanding of biblical Hebrew grammar, at least in Israel. And we would do very well in the West to take this more into consideration, to take her work on biblical Hebrew syntax and semantics more seriously. I mean, many people just haven't heard of her, and that's part of what I want to do here is to encourage us to read her work carefully and to incorporate her analyses in more detail. So thank you for listening to this short blurb on Edith and her work, and I hope you have found it helpful.